All right. As I said, hello everybody. So there's two topics on the agenda for today. Jason's gonna present his HTTP, and I forget the second word, specification proposal. And then after that, we'll just have a lively discussion on the mediation. So take it away, Jason.
Okay, I'm not sharing. So I sent out a doc on Monday, and it's a bit short notice. Sorry about that. I can go give an overview of that. There's a couple of high-level questions I'd like to kind of consider from this group. Namely, ought we support things like OpenAPI in Istio or not? If we don't want to do that, then it's sort of a moot point to go into to figure out how we're going to represent it. Yeah.
And as always, if you're not talking and you're not on mute and you are typing, please stop.
Or mute. Thank you.
So that's probably the biggest thing is in the past I'd said, okay, I think this is not contentious. Let's do something with OpenAPI or gRPC. And I go into a bunch of detail about how it should work. And there's like fundamental disagreement about whether or not we should do that. So maybe if we can kind of think and talk about that a bit, and then maybe get into some of the details. I'm not expecting to have some consensus today for how this ought to work. I expect to continue this discussion offline over the next few weeks.
So the OpenAPI support, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So that discussion, are you talking about whether you are basically going to externally import things with a tool from OpenAPI into our Istio, API specification versus, like, I'm not sure what the question you're asking, versus, actually having some first class, ability to just give an OpenAPI specification, say that's the way you do this, or one of the ways.
That's what I'd like to figure out, because people have OpenAPI specs. They have gRPC services. They're going to want to run those in Istio and have some API level awareness of them. How does that work? We have a kind of minimal spec right now that is sufficient to enable the runtime components in Istio to have API management type features. Is that good enough? And anything else among that, we say it's your problem, you deal with it. You do your own conversion from OpenAPI or RAML or gRPC or whatever. It's not our problem. And then we're just, it'd be a very short meeting and we can just move on otherwise. But maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe we should add some support in Istio to do this conversion process or this normalization process. And if we decide to do that, how should it work in a maintainable way? It should be on the client side. So we provide some tooling, but it's not in mesh. Or should we provide some hooks in the config ingestion pipeline to do the normalization when you push a spec into Istio along with the rest of the config? Those are the sorts of things I'd like to understand, but to understand.
So was there somebody who actually did object to having OpenAPI support, given that's probably one of the most standard ways to do this in the industry, right?
Yes. Well, they said that the most, I'm still trying to figure out how to share this doc and talk at the same time.
Well, talking goes over there. Okay.
Well, no, it's not. No, no, I'm trying to find the doc to share.
5 second pause.
5 second pause. Multitasking. No. Okay. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. Now, what was I saying? Oh, yeah. So, is there objection to OpenAPI? Yeah. The objection is it's not just OpenAPI, right? So, it's there's different levels of consideration. So there is just OpenAPI. OpenAPI itself is a very large standard. There's version 2, version 3. Trying to support all of OpenAPI is is a big task to take on, and there's a lot of compatibility issues that at least at Google we've had to deal with in terms of things being underspecified, or yeah, in terms of things being underspecified. Beyond that, and then you have multiple specifications, HTTP specifications. So maybe somebody doesn't like OpenAPI, but they have something else they want to use. Or are we very opinionated about this and say it's just OpenAPI? That's probably not good enough because we have gRPC. So we at least need to support 2. And then once we support 2, maybe there's more and more things that we might want to have a story for. How would we do that in a reasonable way? There's not just HTTP APIs, there's other protocols as well. Should we consider that? And so you kind of go down this rabbit hole. The approach we've taken is to step back and say, what's the minimal amount we can do that we all agree on? We all agree we need some normalized form. That's just the path and the method that corresponds to some operation. But we definitely need that. So we added that, and then everything beyond that is a whole argument to me whether it's necessary or not.
So you're basically saying that there's this discussion of whether, if you're not going to say we don't support any of these, standard format of specifying your APIs, if we're not going to support, or if we're going to support any of them, then we have to at least kind of pick some reasonable subset of more than, not just OpenAPI version, whatever. It has to be some subset or nothing, I guess, is kind of the alternative, and say, like you said, we leave this as an exercise for the customer. They have to convert themselves with whatever tools they want.
Yeah, so that's sort of what I tried to highlight in this talk was we have this minimal form, this normalized form, and that's good and necessary, but we could add some allowance for supporting other API specifications. And if we do that, what's the criteria for adding them? Because we don't want to just add everything that anybody has ever invented for defining an API, because that's just not maintainable. But a smaller subset, we could be a bit opinionated about it, certainly to start with. So I say OpenAPI and gRPC. And then how might that work? And I expect it to be a moving target, so we're not going to, even if we said we want to support everything in OpenAPI, which is probably not the right thing to do, but if we did, for argument's sake, we wouldn't start there. We can start with a much smaller subset and document, here are the features that we support within that specification. Specifically, what are we looking at in that OpenAPI spec? How are we normalizing it into the form that the rest of Istio uses? Because one of the other key points is I don't think we want all of these different API specifications to be distributed throughout the whole system. That's even harder to maintain. We don't want an OpenAPI spec in the proxy.
So what's the problem if we model this as community maintained client libraries or tooling? So we only support one, and having all different kinds of these formats. We say we're going to support, and there's a conversion tools, and there's open to the community. It's, so for whatever people want Istio to support, they can just plug in their conversion tool, and this is all maintained by the community.
And I think that requires a strong common support in the proxy. Right? The normalized form needs to be able to express a variety of formats. So I agree. I think that's the right approach. I would prefer a model where we support OpenAPI and it flows this way, and we'll open the doors, and we'll work with partners that want to extend this to support other formats. And if they find that our low-level stuff is not expressive enough, we'll work with them to extend the core stuff so it's expressive enough for their models. And that's kind of where we stop.
So you're saying that there'd be one reference implementation of a plugged-in external thing. Like there's sort of the canonical or normalized form is sort of what we expect, and there's a mechanism to register other types of converting things, and we implement one of them in open source, probably OpenAPI, one of the V3, whatever. And you say that everything else is, but that's the reference implementation. People can plug in, and communities can, the community can plug in other versions. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, except there'd probably be two, a gRPC and the Open API spec.
So can I take 2 steps back and ask, oh, sorry. I have no idea if I'm appearing on the screen. I can't figure that out. But why, I think I know the answer. Why do we think it's important that Istio understands the URL patterns and verbs?
Why do we need to understand that? So the core Istio capabilities of ACLs and quota and telemetry right now is dimensioned by service. You can also define that against the raw HTTP headers, path.
Right, you can do all that, right?
But there may be APIs that are defined as not the full path. So you may have a path that includes like the resource ID, which is unique and changing, and you don't want to have quota on a particular object in a collection. You'll have a quota on the collection as a whole.
I mean, I think, right. So, I mean, I think you want to do this to make it more convenient for people to configure the Istio mesh to do different things for different APIs. What I'm wondering is, and we've been working on a mixer adapter as we've discussed, and so are you. It would be nice if a mixer adapter could consume everything in the Open API spec, including the security specification and things like that, so that it could then decide what to do based on what's in the Open API spec. But in order for that to work, there has to be some way to distribute the Open API spec to a mixer adapter. Otherwise, you have to tell Istio about your Open API spec, and then you've got to tell your mixer adapter about it again.
I think that's a very interesting kind of enabler that you're asking. So let me give a shorter answer than Jason just did on your first question. I think we want to be able to apply policies and collect telemetry and the granularity of an API instead of just right. So that's the objective. Now to your second point, we do need to do a lot of work in the proxy. Right? We need, like for example, I want to be able to make routing decisions based on the path, or based on the user identity, or based on what we decoded from the job tokens, based on the method, all this kind of stuff. I want to be able to, the proxy needs to be able to cache answers to a lot of to the check calls. So in order to be able to cache properly, it needs to have decoded these things to find enough level of detail. So in the general case, I don't think we can do everything in the mixer. We have to do some of it in the proxy, and that's why we end up with this normalized form that's simpler and more straight to the point for what the proxy needs.
So if the proxy says, I made a decision based on an abstract URL pattern instead of a specific URL, then the proxy can do better caching. Okay, I hadn't thought of that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that applies to quotas and everything else. So now, assuming we do that, there's still nothing preventing us from also delivering the Open API spec all the way down, or the normalized API spec all the way down, and make it available to the adapters.
Right, because that's where I guess I'm sort of imagining a world where, hey, I have an API and I run some policies based on URL patterns, and I told Istio to extract the URL patterns from my Open API spec, and then I want to do API management, and I want to automatically enforce the security requirements in that Open API spec. So I got to tell my mixer about the spec again. And
okay. Well, so hold on. Part of what we're trying to do in the proxy is to decode this information and produce it as attributes. So the only reason you would need to look at the API spec in the adapter is if the proxy didn't decode the information you needed.
Yeah.
Okay. So
right.
Would that be an easier solution?
It might be, yeah. But it would be all the information, and plus keep in mind that Open API is user extensible. So if IBM decides they want to add X IBM mainframe transaction ID, then and a mixer adapter wants to use that in theory, it might be nice if that was accessible.
So,
What
so
else?
this, I think we have to be careful about taking on too much. So
Sure.
I mean, we can certainly build a system with the infrastructure we have now where you can do just that. You can have specific extensions, and you have an admission controller which looks at that and maybe generates other Istio config for authentication policy or quota or anything else. That's possible. Nothing can stop you from doing that. Should we encourage that, or should we try to push that config authorship to a kind of single spot that is consistent with the rest of the config architecture that we have in Istio? So that's a possibility. You could, again, because if we have open API in a system, your mixture adapter could just have special cases for the extensions that you're looking at. Again, we can't prevent that, but I think we want to discourage that and have a more systematic way of defining policy that's not unique to a particular adapter.
But there's always room for an escape valve.
Yeah, there's always room for an escape valve. It's just what do we want to say is becomes the canonical
right.
Yeah.
that, and if we can lift things up so it's not specific to an Apogee adapter, or
No, we wouldn't want to do that. But it would be cool if, for instance, the security sections of the Open API spec were transmitted or were consumable in the mixer.
right. So that's one of the motivations for including the spec. So the advantage of just using the normalized form, which I have on the screen now, is we don't have to deal with any of this. So it is conceptually simple. Every component, pilot, mixer is just looking at the normalized spec form, and that's just a list of patterns that correspond to operation. And that's the necessary and good part, but it's not sufficient. If we had a way to reference the original specification of the API spec, then you have this escape valve, so you can do all sorts of clever things if you wanted to. You could also have some support for auto-normalization. So you don't need client-side tooling to convert from to generate the normalized spec from the Open API. You can do some of that automatically.
Well, then it would be more flexible in the event that new API specifications and version specifications come along.
I didn't catch the beginning of that.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. So I understand. If you only implement this in Istio and you do the translation from Open API to this in a tool, then when Open API 4 comes along, you won't have to build that into every Istio in the world.
Right. So we definitely want to, if we decide that there is merit in having some Open API awareness or gRPC awareness in Istio, we should kind of limit the blast radius of that. So if you have some underspecified feature, are you going to see that show up in the proxy? That would be a bad thing. You're having to do all that interpretation of Open API rules in runtime.
Yeah, so this reaches the discussion. One of the key things we're looking at in the config space is separation between the user experience and the runtime state that the system consumes. This is appropriate this is what the runtime needs to evaluate things, and the user level stuff is as a separable concern. So the key is, how is this expressive enough? Is this low level thing expressive enough to address most of Open API and most of these other weird formats that are the mainstream?
I'd say it's sufficient for enabling API management type features for your capabilities. It's beyond that, if you're getting into security definitions or parameter checking, no, it's not sufficient. But there was one case I think that could possibly be used, but I didn't really see people asking for that. There was a lot more request for just having API level awareness of the policy that we have in this data. And even request level validation is over the path and the method. We're not validating parameters.
Okay, so in that context, then, how it seems like a reasonable thing that we could make the Open API spec available, or the input document available to the adapter at one time.
Yes, and that's the thing to be careful of is so we can adjust Open API, but we want to be careful of who's consuming that. So we can say there is an emission controller that consumes that and does the normalization to a known common format. Everybody uses format.
Yeah, well, I thought this was.
That's what. Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I have here. And then anytime you add a new API spec, you add a new emission controller or update the emission controller normalization, and none of the rest of this needs to change. No proxy change, no pilot change.
Yeah, that's the best case.
That's the best case. But as an escape valve, if you had a mixer adapter and you really wanted to use OpenAPI, you still have the reference available. So you can look at, oh, here's the normalized form. I want to see where that originated from. Okay, well, here's the actual OpenAPI spec. And then you could reason about it. And if there's enough commonality that somebody's reaching out to look at the original OpenAPI spec or the gRPC spec, and there's something in common between the two, then you could move that into the normalized form. But you can do it incrementally over time rather than trying to upfront create a superset spec that addresses every conceivable HTTP.
So is a similar model appropriate for non-HTTP protocols? So I don't know if there's any value in us doing this. The user specifies some. No, I guess like I want to apply policies on MySQL commands somehow. So you'd have an adapter that specifically understands the MySQL protocol.
It's possible, but I'd like to avoid that to start with. I think you could get pretty far just focusing on the HTTP part. And that's contentious enough about what goes in, what can go in, how do you support it, without trying to consider how it also works. Because essentially then you're trying to create a superset API specification that addresses HTTP and every other conceivable protocol, which is just...
No, I'm not suggesting we normalize from anything to our form. I'm just wondering the phases in the pipeline that we've got. Right, so you got the input phase, transformation phase, decoding in the proxy, and then processing in the mixer.
I suspect you could follow a similar recipe. It might not look exactly the same. So something like SQL might be very specific to SQL. Or you might have SQL variants, and you say, we're going to normalize into some SQL, not MySQL or SQL.
So without proxy support, though, we can't do anything with SQL.
And Redis is one. So Envoy has some support for Redis. So you could, if there was some schema that you could provide to it, we could add an API for that. That might be a better motivation for a better way to drive that, not just in the abstract.
But the key observation is that for each fundamental protocol, there needs to be explicit support in the proxy for it. And then we can build stuff around it.
If it's implemented in the proxy. So from a user point of view, I'm not thinking, I don't want somebody to think, I'm writing normalized spec, this HTTP normalized spec because the proxy needs it. I want somebody writing that because they say, I really don't like OpenAPI. I'm the vocal minority that likes to use just REST. But I saw the APIs, so I can use a normalized spec and write it in that form. Or I have an OpenAPI and it will get reduced to that common format. And then wherever that goes, I don't really care. It could go directly to the proxy. It could go to the mixer. The mixer could push stuff down to the mixer client. I know we've discussed that at some point. You could have a purely mixer-based version of this if you didn't care about caching or if you had a different caching strategy. That you're getting into the component level thing. Ultimately, the user.
So it would be useful if you can walk through a few examples of this proposal about the high level and the API spec and how is that different from the existing API spec in the config. So maybe
what we currently have.
Yes, and what's the value has been added to with these forms.
Okay. So what we did a few months back to add initial support for API management to Istio was define some component level config. We defined a mixer client config for an API spec, the API key, quota, and user authentication policy. But that's all mixer client config, and you have to define which proxy gets that mixer client, that particular mixer client config, which is in alignment with the overall config working group's intent for user intent-based.
Yeah, but we have a discussion about moving a lot of those features out of the mixer client config into
Right.
into.
So that's what this is.
So my understanding is this gonna replace that config in Mixer client, and Mixer client will eventually get this config.
Yeah. Well, they're separate things. So whatever we have in the Mixer client now, the Mixer client can continue to consume that. We have code, it can be improved over time, but fundamentally it's getting the whatever is an Istio API. It just so happens that that form looks just like, very, very similar to the normalized spec form I'm proposing here, because it is the minimal amount that you would need to define an HTTP API.
Yeah, so we have a config format that the code, the component level stuff consumes, and then something that looks a lot like it that is for the consumer. The difference is the consumer is no longer programming the proxy, the consumer is programming Istio to achieve a particular behavior.
Yeah, so the translation is not a terribly complicated transformation from the user-facing HTTP API normalized spec that I have on the screen now into the Mixer client. It's almost a one-to-one.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. I mean, when user writing API spec, they should just write a resource that says my API spec. That's what's meant for, instead of writing a Mixer config. So I think the only disconnection is why this one cannot be just the form that Mixer client actually reads, and part of their configuration, they're replacing the existing one instead of we having to maintain two of this. Because that's kind of opened the door, like they can actually config the API through the Mixer client config and through this, and that's kind of create confusion unless
So a specific reason why that would not be good is, or why that it could work, but it's not desirable. The current Mixer client API spec has Envoy specific fields. It says, here's the cluster you need to use for, this is generally, maybe not specific to API specs, but just general with Mixer client. Here's a cluster, Envoy cluster you need to use to access to fetch your job. Okay. That shows up in the user-facing config in the Mixer client, if we use Mixer client config directly. That's not good. So there over time, there may be things where we add Envoy specific fields to the Mixer client config that should not be exposed to the user error.
Right, so as part of our config transformation pipeline, this is the kind of stuff that we discover at runtime. Oh, this is what we need to tell that proxy specifically. And that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And then there's also how you would define it against the service. So here in the proposed form, just called HTTP API spec, it includes a reference to the normalized form. And that is very similar to what would be given to the normalized form is very similar to what would be given to the Mixer client. But it also has bindings for which services it should be sent to, or which gateways or edge proxies in the mesh you might need to send those to.
So how do we go from the API spec to this at this point? What's doing the conversion?
So here's one proposal.
Like in today's,
some code living in a random repo.
Okay.
Yeah. You write it by hand, pretty much, because we haven't gotten.
The end-to-end.
Yeah. So one way this would evolve is we take you update Istio control to do the conversion. So Istio control takes an open API spec and spits out a normalized form. But that's client side. So if you want to update it, somebody's going to use an old version of the tooling. It's not consistent with the version of Istio that we ship. We might want to, we still have a reference to the original spec. So if you had a Mixer adapter that wanted to do some experiments and maybe do some parameter validation or something, it still doesn't have a reference to it. So you start adding annotations on the CRD. So like, here's a reference to the spec that I used on the client tooling to create the normalized form, and maybe that exists or maybe it doesn't, and it's not consistent from adapter to adapter. So the next logical thing might be to move that server side. And that's what this picture shows. Is you have a HTTP API spec, which is in the form of a CRD, that has some binding to a particular service. It might have the normalized form, or it might have the schematized form, the open API. Not both. At the same time. So walking through this, assuming we just have the normalized form, assuming I'm a user who doesn't like the open API and I want to write my own mappings myself. So I do that. In step one, I push it to the API server. There's various webhooks that will look at that to see if any conversion, any normalization needs to be done. The first webhook. Number two, it doesn't do anything because it doesn't see that there's a schema that needs to be normalized. So it's sort of a no-op. The second webhook here, number three, will look and verify that the spec is well formed. So it's bound to a service. It has a normalized HTTP spec that's well formed, and it'll say yes, that's actually allowed. So that's our config validation. The rest of Istio has the same sort of thing. So at that point, there is an HTTP that we would let the resource be created, and it would be visible to the rest of the components of the system. So we have an HTTP API spec that, say, Pilot might be watching. It would see that that spec exists now and is bound to some set of services, and it could deliver. It could create the equivalent mixer client config that needs to be delivered to proxies, and then we're done.
Yeah. Okay, but so in this model though, you're already starting with a normalized form. The number one.
That's when you're starting with the normalized form. So now, suppose I have an open API spec. When I say open API, it's gRPC or something else too.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily limited to open. I wouldn't specify the normalized form because why would I? Here's a schema. I want you to do that normalization. So I post it to the API server. The second webhook would see that there is a schema that's non-nil.
So first, in order to post it to the API server, you'd actually need to corrupt it a little bit, right? You need to add the Kubernetes GUI in front of it.
Right. So this is all within the HTTP CRD. So in your CRD, you'd have
you have a reference to a file that's your API spec?
So you could do a reference. There's some downsides to that. We're not authoritative, so if it's changes out from under us, we don't.
I thought the file would be referenced at the point where it's consumed.
There's syntactic sugar we could do on the client side. So in Istio control, you could say Istio control create API spec, and I pointed out a file, my open API file.
Yeah.
And then client side, we just take that file and we copy the contents inline to the CRD, and we hand the whole thing over to the API server. Okay. I think that's preferable, size permitting, because now we have a snapshot of the API spec.
Yeah.
There's some issues with external references within Open API itself that we have to deal with, because it can have its own. So
you might have to do this.
You have you have to look and include all the transitive dependencies in the Open API, which, by the way, is what gRPC proto descriptor set already does.
Okay, so that kind of stuff is doable on the client side.
So that's so we're not manipulating. We're saying here's a snapshot of everything the user's given us. We've made it a bit easier so you don't have to cap files and set and base 64 code. So at that point, in number one, HTTP spec has an inline schema down to some services. Now the first webhook can look and see that there's a schema there, and it can, if it recognizes the type, it can do some normalization.
So I see downsides to that version of the approach, because now I'm running more opinionated, more complicated work within the mesh to do this conversion, and it's really completely orthogonal to the work that the mesh is supposed to do. The mesh is processing incoming requests, and now it's got this little extra computation that it's doing on the side to produce this state. And from the user flow, there is no real advantage. It's the same. I type the same commands.
Yeah, I think Greg just made a comment in the doc saying that nothing prevents you from doing this client side.
Yeah, nothing prevents you from doing the client side, and that approach has worked well for gRPs for protobufs. Maybe I'm not as plugged into Kubernetes as I should be, but I feel like we're going to turn the world of Kubernetes into these giant spaghettis of webhooks, and then we're going to need Istio to manage all the Kubernetes webhooks to keep Kubernetes from falling over, and then we're going to need API management.
We also can't rely on Kubernetes, right?
Oh, that's an excellent point, Scott. Except that we do we do rely on the API server, though.
Yeah, it is limited in scope to the API server.
So would you think there's a problem of using Galley and to do these mutations? And
if we had our own config server, a lot of this is either the config server or you're at your own sort of thing.
Or honestly, through CI/CD pipeline, right?
Can you repeat that, please?
Or through CI/CD pipeline, like all anything that can be done through config can all be done through a CI/CD pipeline. And
Okay, so let me.
Yeah.
So there's probably two things to consider. So suppose, let me just finish talking through this, and then make the point. So we do some server-side normalization. Now within at point 3, which is independent of point 2, point 3 will look and see, okay, this is well formed. It doesn't look at the schema. It doesn't care about that. It just says there's a normalized form, it's well formed, it's bound to some services. Great. I'll let that be created. Now pilot does the same thing, no changes. It looks at the normalized form, sees it's bound to some services, generates proxy config.
Yeah.
But now, if you had a mixture adapter, it could look at that same thing and say, oh, look, there's a schema in there for an open API spec. Let me do something with it. And it could do that. It can actually reason about the original user input.
Yep.
If we had client side, if we did this on the client side, you could move number 2. So you can move number 2 to the client side, but still include the full copy.
Yeah.
In which case, we've offloaded some normalization, but it's still sent throughout the system, and we still have a snapshot of it.
Or if I have, in particular, I might say, you know what, I want to write my own converter that's going to convert the open API spec to the generic schema. And I'm going to set attributes on the generic schema that tell me what the security attribute was and what the X IBM mainframe transaction ID attribute was. And I can extend it all I want. And it doesn't matter whether or not Istio supports open API. So at least enabling it on the client side seems to me to be a very powerful capability.
Yeah, so I think there's more than one way to slice this. I think that the important part of that is, even if you did it on the client side, with the exception of number 2, the rest of the diagram looks the same. You still have some validation to make sure that it was well formed and that the normalized form that the rest of the pilot and everybody's using is there. You don't want pilot looking at some kind of one-off annotated open API spec.
So are there things we could do in the normalized form to make it easier to do like the security stuff? We don't do any of the security stuff, but there's a good place for somebody to do an extended tool that does that with
Yeah. Or having standard attributes for certain aspects of like, hey, by the way, the API key attribute is always called, open API v2.api key or whatever. And actually, Martinelli just left. He's one of the vocal minority who prefers REST. And even the word operation is not universally loved. How about the operation should just be an attribute rather than hard coding that into the spec?
So that is actually what we have now.
Okay, good. Then in that case,
it's fairly open-ended, and there was some question about, do we want to be more opinionated or just keep it as a map of
You've parsed the URL, you've parsed the method, and you've come up with some attributes. I think
Here's the thing. Yeah, there's still an argument to be made for having a standard set of attributes, but what specific attributes you use is a bit flexible.
So just a time check. There's I'd like to keep so there's
So does everybody get the general idea of what is proposed here? I mean, are there specifics we can dive into? Should it all be done client side? Should we have an option for client side, but also server side? What parts of the spec should we look at or not look at on the server side or client side, for that matter? There's quite a bit that can be done there if we decide to go down this road.
So at least from my point of view, so supporting anything in addition to open API, open API format, this should be done on the client side. It's kind of giving tools and the community maintain the tool sets for dealing with specific formats. So regarding how this API spec, the model to transform into the form pilot understand, I think we should getting aligned with other config transformation pipeline as we're gonna decide on how. So Martin has the config architecture doc. He has a number of options we can do with along with other configs. I think it'd be good to have this one be in the same way as the other configs aligned.
Yeah, this assumes the current config model, which we have no, separate config authorship thing that is outside the API server, so that can certainly be subject to change.
Yeah, this adds an extra dimension on top of the options we have already.
Yes.
Because this normalization is effectively something you can do completely independent of Istio, I'll do whatever I want and produce this file, and then that enters the normal Istio pipeline. Or you can shift everything right by one notch and say, okay, some of it is done inside of Istio. My preference is anything that doesn't need to be in the mesh should not be.
Well, then,
unless the user experience is impacted.
the user experience, very to the point of wanting to have the mixture adapter reason about this. So
Yeah. So fine, flow the source document through, but you don't have to think about it inside the mesh.
Yeah, it seems like the mesh should be oriented on specific features, not on the whole, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the mesh itself, I agree. But at some point when we push config into Istio, we want some consistency. So should that consistency include something like an open API spec? And should there be anything we do to make it easier to push those into Istio? And so yeah, again, it might come down to if we have a different config authorship model, and we don't need to rely on a webhook to do it, then great. We just move the box there to.
Yeah, I mean, it also seems like this fits into the larger config, the intent-based config better than it does the low-level config.
Correct.
Yeah, this is definitely motivated by the move to the higher-level user-facing config.
I mean, I assume all of this still rests on what's there, like the existing authentication stuff for JOT tokens and the routing and everything else.
Yes.
It doesn't preempt any of that.
No. Well, okay, so that's maybe I'll continue looking at the doc, and if there's any discussions on email, we can continue it there, and then I guess in 2 weeks, see if there's reasonable consensus or minimal consensus on how we want this to work, and to figure out next steps, and see the remaining time for mediation.
And I think it'd be interesting to, as we firm up the config story, to tie it all together at that point.
Yeah, there's probably incremental steps to get this introduced without going and adopting the full thing, and depending on the config architecture.
So do we have a handy OpenAPI parser at this point that we can use
for normalized formats?
I'm sure Tim Burks would love to help you with this.
Yeah. Well, I used Gnostic when I did the prototype. So
yeah.
Okay. Which is just converting two parts. You're looping through an array. By the way, this normalization process is not terribly complicated. You loop through an array, and you say, here's a path, and there's verbs on it, and you just append to a list of patterns.
There's people describe this OpenAPI spec as this big monster at this point.
Well,
so
once you get to the it is.
Normalized form can be when you have, how do you do type parameters, the URI template form, do you do the full RFC 6350, or do you do support like the 2% that people actually care about, which is what we use. So that's where you get into the open-endedness of OpenAPI. But the basic mapping of method, path to, or method and template to operation, that part is, it took like an hour or two to learn OpenAPI.
So do we try to limiting the scope to this to those things have HTTP mappings, or we are also open the doors for like including other features and policies into as OpenAPI extensions, and then we plan to support in the future, or that's kind of along the way?
I would say include the full schema for reference. Include the least amount, the minimal amount necessary to make the rest of Istio mesh work. So yes, only the pattern, only the method and path tuples.
Yeah, and as the need arises, we extend the
extend
the normalized form to be richer and richer. Yeah. All right, so let's stop on that front. Who wants to drive a discussion on the mediation? Yeah. No mediation required.
I'm hoping either Frank or Armando.
Yeah, Frank, do you? I'm fine driving, but I think you have studied both of those well, and
yeah, I can start. So yeah, I was looking. Well, So Nandan, I guess, has a document that he just put out, which is kind of interesting as well. So I'm not sure to what degree we want to talk about it without addressing that, but without looking at that as well. But there's two sides to this, or two questions here in my mind, anyway, on this mediation thing. Mandar, you're in what I have a little demo of using route rules to sort of inject a mediator service basically into the path, and you had sort of a suggested enhancement to the routing rules that does the same thing. It does a similar thing, but more concisely, I guess. Yeah, I'm not sure which is better or worse, and we can discuss that. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, I think this should all be considered a higher level config thing, and whether similar to what we were just talking about, there's sort of a higher level config at the galley level or wherever that is that defines that you want to do something that involves a mediator getting injected, an intermediary type thing, a service or whatever. But the underlying what happens in terms of component config, whether it's route rules that do something similar to my little demo thing that I was trying, or whether it's we extend it and do it the way you suggested, Amanda. I think that's an interesting discussion we can look at. But more importantly, I think that's all stuff that's separate and more transparent to the user, or not visible to the user. But the interesting other thing that's related to this whole picture is what is this mediator? And that was the little demo thing that I put together. It's on the mailing list in the API management news group, and there's a link to a little project where I basically said, okay, when you do mediators, there's a whole lot here that we're kind of glossing over. What is this mediator thing? And I know Nandan's stuff kind of brings up this notion of a mediation engine, which says, are we talking about so it's back to sort of what we were talking about in the last thing. What's the actual scope of Istio here? Are we going to provide sort of some kind of generic mediation service engine that can be configured and programmed to do transformations, and what's this, how many of those things do we have, versus do we just provide a mechanism to say, yeah, when you have mediation involved, you have some way to plug in, basically make Istio do the routing under the covers, whether it's with your routing proposal or what's there. But the real question is, are we talking about the mediators being something that we have as a full-blown service? And like I know the API management solutions, like IBM's, for example, there's ways that you can program. I guess there's almost like, I think it was a language, a compositional language for sort of plugging in and programming the transformations that you want to have. My little example has a little Python program that does a very custom validation thing written in Python, and I want to inject that somehow. So the whole scope of what is a mediator and how's that thing programmed seems to me sort of a more fundamental question than getting the details of are we going to have this thing called a mediation service, or is it going to be some kind of a mediation component like Mixer or so forth. So anyway, that's kind of the discussion from my perspective. So I don't know if other people have strong opinions on any of that.
Yes, I don't think I've heard anybody interested in being Istio itself being in the mediation business. At this point, I think we're more interested in being an enabler for people.
But I think it's like Mixer in that sense. Well, at least again, maybe we're getting ahead of it. We should wait till next meeting where Nandan's here and we've looked at his document. But like when he's talking about a Mixer-like thing, where you can plug in stuff into it, like a mediation engine that's kind of a component of Istio, then it starts getting, more fuzzy in my mind. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would tend to have the same philosophy as Martin, which is that it needs to be pluggable, because one thing that we know enterprises need to do is mediate. And there's a lot of mediation in the world and a lot of ways to do it. I know where Nandan is coming from, and he's also thinking that, yes, maybe there's a concept in Istio called a mediation service, but the implementation of that service is completely up to the user. Now, if someone in the open source community thinks it would be fun to build one and have it, ride alongside the Istio project, that would be cool. But I never imagined that we would build a mediation service into Istio as a first-class part of Istio.
Well, yeah, but maybe you could have a simple reference implementation of this thing so you could show how they plug into it. But yeah, I agree. You wouldn't have a full-blown solution. But yeah, it's not clear to me though to what to what degree we need to do the same kind of stuff that Jason was just talking about in terms of getting some canonical representation of information you might need to decide whether you have to, whether Envoy is going to need to, basically redirect the calls to a mediator service, or whether it's going to just let Mixer do it. It's almost like some minimal set of control attributes for that decision. Unless we're saying, this is just completely programmed in Mixer in some custom way, and
Well, with something like the API management, if we don't put the guts in the system, there's no way you can do API-specific routing or API-specific quotas. That has to be there. But for me,
but even on API specific, okay, I guess that's you're saying that right there gives you already the ability to presumably have Envoy decide that it should on the fly use a via config thing or something like that, or not? Is that?
Yeah. So I think for the core, the HTTP decoding stuff, that we need to put the core in to enable the broader functionality. But for this mediation stuff, in theory, Istio could do nothing, right? Mediation is just about one of our customers decides that their service actually is made up of two services. The front one does conversion and then calls the second one, and then Istio is none the wiser. But I think we'd like to do a little better because it's a well-known canonical pattern.
Right, and I think so. At least my motivation behind modeling it as a concise directive, essentially, right, which is via, was exactly that it is a often encountered case, and if we model it directly in the API service, and again, without requiring Galley or anything that's higher level, right? It is part of the routing API service itself, which is why I have slight preference for that, because it is a well-known routing function. It is a well understood routing function, and then if we can actually make it part of that API, that's better. So yeah, so I agree that the other plan, which is to do nothing, is, well, that's where we are today.
Yeah, that works today, and I'm still not 100% sure I'm convinced or can see the benefit of the via thing at the low level config of Envoy level, like at the at the component level config versus some kind of a higher level config, that at the galley level or wherever this intent-based config, because I think you're sort of giving something that's more intent-based than the nuts and bolts of what the envoys are doing under the covers, and maybe that's not true.
It is, yeah, I think it is subjective, because how it's really to what extent you want to specify your intent, right? Like, do you want your intent go do this, or do you want the intent to be go do this in this way, or now are you going to spell out each and every step?
So you're saying the intent shouldn't even have that you're calling an intermediary, really. It's just that this functionality should get called, and whether that's via an intermediary or not should be transparent.
If you want if you want to hoist all the way to that intent, then you should say, I want this type of function, get me that. And then someone will say, okay, well, that function is provided by this intermediary, so I'm going to add via, and then that gets down into Envoy as whatever we decide, however it compiles down to Envoy's config.
Yeah, maybe. I'm still struggling with this. Well, back to this. You know, if I'm going to be trying to say I want some intermediate transformation to happen, so I basically want, you know, what is the user in the config going to be saying where I'm trying to inject some kind of transformation between, you know, between the calls to foo and service bar, and it's this transformation that I have some code, like if my example that I created, right, is just a little Python program that goes and looks at the body of the thing and validates one of the fields, and how do I specify that I want that to, and, you know, in my case it's a service, so I'm basically saying specify here I want this service to get called in the path.
Right.
And is that sort of what we're talking about here, period? There's nothing more general.
At the higher level of intent, you could have capabilities for that service, right? Or have an actual API name for that service as whatever scanner whatever you want to call it. And then at the highest level, you could say that I want service X traffic to always come through this scanner. And at that level, this is not the particular manifestation of service, but this is a capability. And somewhere along the path, it gets translated into, okay, well, which service provides that? Okay, Apogee provides that. So I'm now going to send the traffic to Apogee, and that will be done by via, or, well, if not via, something else. But so that's how I look at the specific intent versus like abstract intent.
All right, guys, we're running out of time. So I think we need to continue the discussion.
Yep.
It's all actually very interesting. And it all ties into the config model story as well. This VIA thing could plug in at different levels
Yep.
and work properly. All right, so let's continue the discussion online, and we'll meet again in 2 weeks. This will probably be the main topic at that point. And that's about it.
All right.
Thanks a lot, guys. Later.
Bye.
I don't want to hang up.
So what's the mediation model?
It's basically, so requests come in right now, and Mixer only sees headers, or not even headers, but just the high-level metadata. There's a need for many services, legacy services in particular, that want to do an automatic transformation between whatever's incoming to whatever they want.
Oh, okay.
So you stick another service in there that's doing this transformation, and the idea is if we don't do anything, people can do this themselves. Right? They can just
they sing their own service, and they just directing traffic, everything there,
and then to the other one.
Yes.
But if we know that this is a very common pattern, so for example, maybe there's no, if you just put a bunch of services together, you're going to do Envoy multiple times. And the mediation thing, even though it's not interesting at a semantic level, is going to show up in the user as a separate service.
So maybe that